Hello, and welcome back to the Tangles and Tunes channel. My name is David, and I'm going to guide you through today's art session. In one of my recent videos, I showed you step by step how to create your own gemstone, or Zen Gems, as they're often called in Zentangle, and we tried to go for that semi-realistic, glossy, and reflective look. And I showed you several different ways to create those gems, but we just left it there without really doing a composition or putting them together in any sort of tile. So in this video, I wanted to show you at least one sample of what you could do with those Zen Gems. Now in the beginning here, you can see that I'm simply creating those gems. And I have sped up the process here just so that it doesn't get too long and tedious for those of you who already have seen my previous video on how to do this. The process is still clear as you watch, but it just goes by a little bit more quickly. If you do need those additional details, you could watch my previous video where I break it down for you in a very easy to follow step-by-step manner. But here I just wanted to create a couple different gems, and I used different colors than I did in the original video as well, just so you could see another couple examples of how these can come together with different sort of artifacts or imperfections that go into the gem itself, purposely leaving streaks and different kinds of blending used in the colors, just to create different effects so that they're not all exactly the same. But in the same fashion as I did before, we're laying down several different layers of colors that are progressively darker in this case, and then I'm using a blending pencil to smooth out those rough lines and to sort of blend and smear that coloration around to give it a more natural look, or at least one with less streaks and stripes in it, other than those that I purposely and intentionally wanted to reflect that light passing through the gemstone. Now, once I got done, I go on to the embellishment process, and I decided to create some auras around each gem just to give me a little bit of a barrier, if you will, or a boundary, wherein I could add additional embellishments as I go and kind of separate it from the gem itself to make it look like it's actually embedded into a setting of some kind. Now, in this case, I had an idea where I wanted to use a particular tangle to add a bold embellishment around this gem, or a setting, if you will. So I created a wider aura and then separated even that aura with one additional very thin aura. And by thin aura, I just mean that I kept the spaces between those lines quite small. And now I'm using a tangle pattern called Doodah. It's a very simple pattern where you alternate lines that go from each side of a given border, and you just continue that process all the way around. And there are various ways that this can be embellished as well by adding additional details or little dots or roundings, all kinds of different neat things that you can do. But what I ended up doing here, as you'll see in just a moment, is I decided instead of doing a further embellishment, I just wanted to make those lines or that pattern itself really stand out. So I decided to go back and create a boldness, so we might call this weighting in Zentangle, where we add additional ink to lines and try to adjust or sculpt their shape a little bit. But in this case, it's even simpler than that. I'm just making them bolder and larger or wider, and I do that all the way around both the outside and the inside lines of that Doodah shape or pattern that I initially laid down. So you'll see that coming together here, and it will create more of a striking contrast to the other details in the tile so far. And that was part of the reason I did that, to add some of that boldness and drama to the inked pieces. And as we get through with this, you'll see what we do in the next pattern as I try to embellish the setting for the blue gem. And so now we move here and I do a variation of the tangle pattern Crescent Moon, and that can be done, as almost all patterns, in multiple different ways. I took a simplified approach and I made those initial little ladybug shapes without inking it in. I wanted something a little lighter, a little less bold, or a little less contrast as I did with my Doodah shape. And so instead of inking those centers, I just created little lines that would help distinguish it or separate it from the rest of the pattern. And then I draw some little connecting lines there to kind of separate. It's almost like petals, but it really is based on the crescent moon pattern. Now, a lot of this I did speed up, as you can see in the video during the editing process. I figured we didn't need to sit and stare at me going for hours and hours on these same processes over and over, but I included enough so that you could see each of the steps. I slowed down where I introduce a new pattern or a new technique, and then just speed up and edit accordingly to keep it from getting too monotonous or boring. But this tangle pattern is kind of a version or a modification of Mooka. It doesn't quite have the bulbous end that it normally would, and this could also be likened to one of the other patterns. Its name escapes me at the moment, but it would be very similar to that other pattern that's drawn in this same way, but I've just added some different embellishments to it, some little wings, if you will, or petals, or some design elements that will just help flesh it out and help it to fill a little more space than we might normally use with a pattern like this. It's just one way of many where you can embellish. And all of this was done without planning. I did not have a roadmap I was following. I just sort of did what came to me as I was working on this tile. And now I begin to use a very common pattern called Flux. I really like this pattern. I use it a lot in tiles, which may or may not irritate those of you who watch. I just find it to be a very flexible pattern. It allows itself to be squeezed into just about any space or area. It can be made small or large. There are different ways to draw it as far as the embellishments itself. And it's just a neat flowering or botanical type tangle that fits very nicely with so many others. And so I do perhaps overuse it, but when I'm just drawing from muscle memory, so to speak, that happens sometimes. But it did fill in nicely here and gave it a little softer background that we could look at with those gems taking the predominant pattern in the tile. I thought these would help give a nice fill, sort of a softness, as I said, to that overall appearance. So I'm just kind of squeezing them into areas to fill spaces and to give some sense of shape to the overall composition. When you have such a bold pattern as those Zen Gems with the color and the other boldness of their settings, I didn't want to put so much into the background tile itself or too many different shapes that had too much intricate detail, but I wanted some detail. I wanted something that set it apart and gave me the opportunity to fill a lot of these open spaces. But I tried to use tangle patterns that were not overly complex so that they didn't have so many lines going on as we looked at this tile that the eye would become fatigued, so to speak. Now, I may not have achieved that, but that was sort of my goal here and why I used just so few and relatively simple tangle patterns to fill out the rest of this tile. I added that other leaf shape there, as you can see, and then I go back to adding a Fescu variation where I make fescue, but I made the end of it a little larger and left a tiny white, like a glistening spot, and then I gave it a second part to that stem just to make it a little heavier and thicker as it fills in that space here. I didn't want just the dainty little single line, so I added that additional little loop on there, but still using it in much the same way as people tend to use the fescue tangle. And it just added a little variety between those similar patterns. Now here I decided to kind of frame the drawing, so to speak, by adding a border. And I didn't pre-plan that part of it either, so I just had to sort of fit it in, and I liked the idea that parts of the composition would be outside of the border or the frame, if you will, and then other parts would remain within. And it just gave me sort of a neat option here. In a moment, you'll see where I just inked in everything within the border, but left that white of the tile itself as a natural built-in frame, so to speak. So here I'm just going about and inking in all of the background spaces that were remaining after I had completed putting the tangle patterns in where I wanted and framing it. Now it was just a matter of inking those spaces in to create an overall composition to it. It created an overall sense, if you will, where everything was bound together that way, and it didn't look like just lots of empty space, but this sort of brought the pieces together. And of course, I've sped up a lot of this and edited just for sake of time. You can see exactly what I'm doing here, just inking in everywhere that background space was open, and anywhere within the frame, as you can see there, where there just was no tangle at all. It just brings it all together more cohesively, in my opinion, and creates some additional contrast and boldness. Now here I've decided to go back. Of course, I left this out on purpose because these acrylic inks will often, or paint it actually is, it's an acrylic paint pen, they will actually smear quite easily, so I reserved that toward the end. I didn't want my hand rubbing that off and smearing it around the tile as I continued to work on it. So I saved this part for one of the final steps just to add that glistening sense. And now we move into the shading. So I'm doing several things here. I'm just laying down graphite in areas where I want to blend it, where I want to create that over and under sense, the overlapping or layers, or just shadows that give these lines more of a three-dimensional shape. And that is exactly what our tonal differences will help do. It just keeps things from looking too flat. And all of these tangles can be shaded and embellished in unique ways. This is just my example here to show you one of a million options for using these Zen Gems in our tangle practice. But just trying to give some form and dimension to these by adding a little shadows around the edges, and as they overlap, it just helps to create that sense of dimension or form, as I've said. Now here around the Doodah shape, I wanted to create a little sense of shadow on the outer and the inner side of Doodah, which would give it a sense of depth, but then by adding a little white chalk down the center, it gives that piece a sense of roundness or curvature, with that highlight across the top and the shadows on the two edges that recede away from us. And I just thought it added a nice little touch that way. And so here we end with our final piece, at least in this particular presentation or composition. But I also wanted to show you several other tiles that I've completed over the last couple days while I was thinking about these Zen Gems and how they could be used. So I've just laid them out here side by side. These are just different size, shapes, and colors of gemstones and different embellishments and compositions in the background. Some look more Art Deco, some look more traditional Zentangle, some look a little crazy with my tentacles there, and then of course today's pattern that I showed, or today's composition. But I hope you've enjoyed this process, and I thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing everyone again real soon back here in the Tangles and Tunes channel.